All right, it appears we have everyone in the room. Let's go back on the record. It is 1:08 p.m. and we will resume where we were. We were in the process of cross-examination of Dr. Miltenberger. I will turn, Dr. Miltenberger, I see you on my screen. So we're there. And then Mr. Becerra, you were in the process of cross-examination. I see you also on my screen. Are there any, before we get started and pick up where we left off, are there any other matters that we should address before we continue with this cross-examination?
Yes, Ms. Kenzie, just one housekeeping item. I understand that Mr. Becerra plans to spend a total of 3 to 3.5 hours on Dr. Miltenberger's cross. And I just want to clarify that similar allocations of time for cross-examination are going to be given to other parties like Kern Water Bank Authority. Well,
what I will say is that it'll be in relative to the testimony of the, as I'm sure you understand, of the witness being cross-examined. I think I see this hearing process is primarily an opportunity for cross-examination. So I'm generally going to be generous with time as long as we're making productive use of that time. So I acknowledge your comment, Mr. Bivens. I will certainly keep it in mind. And I have not imposed, in advance of this hearing, I did not impose cross-examination time limits for a reason. I don't, at least so far, I don't think it's been particularly helpful. What's really helpful is that we're moving forward, and I think all of you have been very professional about that. So does that appropriately acknowledge your comment, Mr. Bivens?
It certainly does. Thank you.
Thank you. Then I will turn to you, Mr. Becerra. You may resume your cross-examination of Dr. Miltenberger.
Thank you very much. Could we please pull up Dr. Miltenberger's exhibit KWBA 6, please, Ms. Mullen? Thank you. And could we please drill down to that area Dr. Miltenberger was discussing previously, which has that sort of greenish triangle shape? And in my use of it, there we go. Could we expand it just a little further? Thank you very much. Okay, Dr. Miltenberger, I'm going to ask you a number of questions just for the record, just to establish where we are. Do you see that we're on your exhibit KWBA 6?
Yes.
And you previously testified about what I'm going to call the greenish area to the left of the screen that's sort of trapezoidal in shape, correct?
Correct.
Just to the east of that, there are bluish areas, correct?
Yes.
And you can see, I think, the word Buena Vista in those greenish areas, correct?
Can you direct me further?
Sure. You see Buena Vista Farms there? Or I think it's Buena Vista Farm. Do you see that text?
I see the text that says Buena Vista Farm Headquarters, the headquarters being abbreviated. And then it looks like there's another, and I see that roughly in Township 30 South, Range 24 East. And it appears, would that be section 18 approximately, maybe 17, 16. And then I see that.
Okay, and so you somewhat anticipated my next question. Do you see the text indicating Township 30 South, Range 25 East?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, thank you. And do you see that there are words Buena Vista just below that line for that township and range?
I think I can make that out. Yes.
Okay. This map indicates that those areas were served by canals branching from the James and Dixon and Johnson Canal, correct?
Well, it's not in, I'm not certain if I could say that for sure, just at the level of the resolution of this. Would you please repeat the question so I understand which canal to be looking at?
Do you see the canal labeled James and Dixon and Johnson Canal?
Yes.
And do you see that there are canals running from that main canal into the bluish shaded areas in Township 30 South, Range 25 East?
It generally appears so, although it's kind of difficult to make out because there's a at this level of resolution, there's just a number of laterals or canals within that area.
Thank you. Do you know whether the James and Dixon and Johnson Canal was a canal subject to the Shaw Decree from 1900?
I don't recall as I sit here.
Could we please pull up Exhibit North Kern 36? And can we scroll down till we see the thank you? Dr. Miltenberger, do you recognize this document as what is commonly known as the Shaw Decree?
Can I see the remaining pages? Actually, can we go back up one? One more, please. Thank you, Ms. Mullen. All right, we can go to the next one, please, Ms. Mullen. We can go to the next one. Thank you.
Can you let us know when you've determined whether you recognize this as the Shaw Decree?
Yes. Ms. Mullen, can you continue to scroll? And the next page, please. And the next page. I can't see from my perspective, Ms. Mullen or Mr. Becerra, approximately how long is this PDF?
It's sizable. Have you ever reviewed the Shaw Decree?
I have, but I don't believe, actually, maybe we go back. I have, I don't recall the copy that I've seen resembles this one in as much as it has a number of annotations that perhaps were provided by Lucian Shaw.
Do you understand that Judge Lucian Shaw issued the Shaw Decree?
Yes.
You understand he did that in the year 1900?
Yes.
Do you recognize Judge Shaw's signature on this page?
Yes.
Do you recognize that he signed it in the year 1900?
Yes.
Do you recognize this document as the 1900 Shaw Decree?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Can we please go to page 8 of this document? Dr. Miltenberger, do you see paragraph 10 starting on line 3?
Yes.
You see that in that paragraph, Judge Shaw made certain determinations about the rights of the James and Dixon Canal Company?
Yes.
Okay. Can we please go back to Dr. Miltenberger's exhibit KWBA6? And while we're doing that, Dr. Miltenberger, do you understand that the 1900 Shaw Decree adjudicated what are known as first point rights?
That's my understanding. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Mullen, can we drill back down on that section we were discussing earlier? Thank you. And for the record, we're back to the area to the west of the name James and Dixon and Johnson Canal. Dr. Miltenberger, do you understand that that canal served the areas in blue in Township 30 South, Range 25 East?
Ms. Mellon, may we bring it up a little bit more? I think that generally seems to be the case. I'm not exactly certain, again, at this level of resolution, precisely what sections of or quarter sections were served, but it does go into that area.
Okay, thank you. So the bluish lands in Range Township 30 South, Range 25 East appear to be served by the James and Dixon and Johnson Canal Company, correct?
Well, it seems like there's other canals serving land in that township as well.
Okay. Do you know whether those lands in blue in Range Township 30 South, Range 25 East were first point lands subject to the Shaw Decree?
I don't know offhand. I believe I'd have to review the Shaw Decree.
We did discuss how the James and Dixon Canal was adjudicated, its rights was adjudicated by the Shaw Decree, correct?
Yes.
And it appears that that canal serves water into Township 30 South, Range 25 East, correct?
Based on this map. But again, I just want to be careful because I haven't reviewed the Shaw Decree to be assured that I'm giving answers that are accurate.
I understand. Dr. Miltenberger, do you understand that the lands of the Kern Water Bank Authority are located in Township 30 South, Range 25 East?
That seems correct.
So based on our review of this map, does it appear that the lands of the Kern Water Bank Authority were first point lands?
Well, again, I would have to.
I'm sorry, repeat the objection, Mr. Bivens. I couldn't hear it.
Lack of foundation.
Well, Dr. Miltenberger, I'll overrule the objection and ask you to answer if you are able to answer.
May I hear the question again?
Sure. And I'll go back and establish the basis for it. Do you see that the bluish lands on your map that appear to be served by the James and Dixon and Johnson Canal are located in Township 30 South, Range 25 East?
Yes.
Are you aware that the Kern Water Bank Authority's lands are located in Township 30 South, Range 25 East.
That's generally my understanding of the location of the water bank.
Do you know on your map, exhibit KWBA6, the bluish lands in that township and range? Do you know whether those bluish lands are now lands owned by the Kern Water Bank Authority?
Well, I know the Kern Water Bank Authority is generally within this area. I don't know precisely the character of ownership. It wasn't part of my research.
Have you toured the Kern Water Bank property?
No.
No. Okay. Thank you very much. I'll proceed to the next subject. Can we please go back to Dr. Miltenberger's testimony, KWBA 1, paragraph 43 on PDF page 30. Thank you, Ms. Mullen. I think we may be on page. There we go. Okay. Revisiting lines 5 through 8, you say that in your opinion, Bulletin 9 provides the most reliable approximation of acreage irrigated in Buena Vista's service area prior to December 19th, 1914, correct?
Correct.
And that analysis and that estimate is 43,600 acres, correct?
Actually, it's slightly more than that. It's 43,610 acres as presented in Bulletin 9.
Okay, thank you very much. Can we please go to Dr. Miltenberger's paragraph 20, which is on, should be on PDF page 13. And actually the portion that, I'm sorry, the portion I'm concerned about should be on PDF page 15. My apologies, Ms. Mullen. There we go. If we could scroll down a little more. Nope. If we could scroll down into paragraph 20, please. I'm looking for the next page, lines 3 through 5. Dr. Miltenberger, in lines 3 through 5 on paragraph 14 of your testimony, you discussed something called a riparian association, correct?
Yes.
What was that association?
My understanding was that it was a group of landowners, many of whom held shares in the Kern Valley Water Company. They formed this group to pursue their riparian claims in court.
And by pursuing their riparian claims in court, do you mean they, among other things, filed the lawsuit that became the decision Lux versus Hagen?
Yes.
Okay. Can we go down to Dr. Miltenberger's paragraph 45? It should be on PDF page 32. Now, in this paragraph, you discuss a different piece of litigation, correct?
Correct.
This is the title insurance and trust versus Miller and Lux case you're discussing here.
Yes.
What was at issue in that case?
Well, I think I explained it here in paragraph 45 that title insurance was successor interest to Frederick Cox, one of the individuals who was part of the riparian association. And they argue that they were entitled to second point water in proportion to the costs that Cox paid as a member of the riparian association.
So Mr. Cox was a member of the riparian association who had rights to second point water, correct?
Well, I want to be careful about giving a legal opinion about what constituted the rights at second point. I might characterize it as an entitlement under the Miller-Hagen agreement.
Okay, I understood. I appreciate your being careful there. Mr. Cox, in your terms, held an entitlement to second point water under the Miller-Hagen agreement, correct?
Correct.
And in 1913, his successor filed a lawsuit against Miller and Lux about that second point entitlement, correct?
Against Miller and Lux and others.
And others. So did Miller and Lux hold an interest in the second point right at that time?
Yes.
And
well,
title
again, be careful. I wouldn't characterize it. I'm sorry. I wouldn't characterize it again as a right as much as entitlement as much as I don't want to give or be seen to be giving a legal opinion as to the scope of the right.
Understood. Miller and Lux held an entitlement to water under the second point right as of 1913. Is that accurate?
I might characterize it a little differently. They held an entitlement to the waters that were to be delivered at the second point of measurement under the terms of the Miller-Hagen agreement.
And title insurance and trust held a similar interest in the water at second point of measurement as of 1913. Is that accurate?
Yes, they had that entitlement.
And you a minute ago described that others also had that entitlement, correct?
Well, I think if I'm recalling correctly, I think my testimony was that there were others involved in the title insurance litigation.
Okay. I appreciate it. Thank you. So let's go back to the transcript on appeal of title insurance, which is exhibit Buena Vista 801. And let me clarify for the record, these are excerpts of that transcript. We could provide the whole transcript, but it's about 800 pages. If we could please go to PDF page 33. Thank you, Ms. Mullen. And if we could scroll down until we see the name CZ Merritt. Dr. Miltenberger, do you cite CZ Merritt's testimony here in your testimony?
I'd just like to consult my written testimony.
I can clarify. It's on page 14, footnote 37, if you'd like to clarify.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. And for the record, we're on transcript page 440 currently, and please feel free to confirm if you like, Dr. Miltenberger.
May we scroll up, please? Mullen? Thank you. Yes.
Was Mr. Merritt employed by Miller and Lux at this time?
I believe he was. He may, if we go to the next page, explain the nature of his engagement with Miller and Lux. Yes, he identifies himself as the office manager, which was my recollection, but I wanted to be sure.
Thank you. Do you know how long Mr. Merritt was employed by Miller and Lux?
According to his testimony, we can see here, he was, since Miller and Lux was incorporated, and I believe Miller and Lux incorporated soon after the Miller-Hagen agreement or around that time. So sometime between 1888, 1889. Although, as I'm looking down here, it looks like he He was employed back in 1881.
And he was testifying in a 1913 trial here, correct?
Yes.
So he was employed by Miller and Lux for at least 30 years. Is that accurate?
Well, he does note that there was a slight intermission there on 1322, or that piece, maybe 2 or 3 lines down. So I would need to look more if he explains sort of how long, if he provides any more information about how long he was employed.
Does it appear he was employed for about 30 years at least by Miller and Lux?
Again, not knowing precisely if he defines slight intermission, certainly he was employed over a number of years.
Okay, thank you. Can we scroll down to the bottom of this page, transcript page 441? Could keep going, please. Does it? Oh, I'm sorry. So do you see here, Dr. Milton Berger, where Mr. Merritt was testifying about a copy of a riparian association agreement dated November 3rd, 1879?
Yes.
Okay, can we please scroll to the next page, which is transcript page 442? And Dr. Milton Berger, do you recognize this as the beginning of a typewritten copy of that riparian association agreement?
Yes.
And the agreement is dated November 3rd, 1879, correct?
Yes.
Okay, can we please scroll down to the next transcript page 443? And can we continue scrolling down? Thank you very much. We can stop with that table. Dr. Milton Berger, do you see that table that begins 14,520 acres and ends in 1,280 acres?
Yes.
And the top line is an entity named Clark and Cox. Do you know whether Frederick Cox was part of that entity?
Yes.
Do you know whether these acreages total 98,188 acres?
Well, I probably have to sit down and do the math offhand, but I believe Mr. Treadwell provides that it's for that total.
Do you trust Mr. Treadwell's math here?
Yes.
So these were the members of the Riparian Association, correct?
Correct.
And they banded together in 1879 to defend water rights on the lower Kern River. Is that accurate?
I think it's probably more accurate to say they were defending what they saw as their riparian rights.
They banded together to protect their water rights in 1879. Is that accurate?
Yes.
And at that time, they collectively held 98,188 acres. Is that accurate?
Yes.
And of those acreage in 1879, Miller and Lux held only 36,644, correct?
Yes.
So as of 1879, these entities who banded together to protect their water rights held much more than 43,600 acres. Is that accurate?
That's accurate, but I think that a focus on that might cause a misleading understanding.
I'm only asking for the math. As of 1879, the entities who banded together in the Riparian Association held 98,188 acres. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interpose an objection on relevance. We don't need Dr. Miltenberger to do simple arithmetic. I think this needs to be tied to the hearing issues.
Mr. Bivens, I anticipate that Mr. Becerra is about to ask something substantive. Am I on the right track, Mr. Becerra?
I can state the theory if you like, Ms. Kinsey.
Sure. That would be great.
As Kern Water Bank Authority has argued, the intent of the appropriators before 1914 has some relationship to the scope of the right. I'm attempting to establish how many acres were contained within the parties who established the second point right before 1914.
And that makes sense to me as relevant and appropriate here. So I will overrule the objection, and you may proceed, Mr. Becerra.
Thank you. Can we please pull up Exhibit North Kern 35? Thank you, Ms. Mullen. Dr. Miltenberger, do you recognize this as what we generally all call the 1888 Miller-Hagen Agreement?
Yes.
Is it fair to say that this agreement remains important to understanding the second point right in the Kern River?
I don't know if I'd quite characterize it that way. I think I'd characterize it a little differently.
Okay, I appreciate that. The parties of the first part in this agreement are the parties that held the second point right after this agreement. Is that accurate?
Again, not wanting to opine on rights, they're certainly the parties that through the agreement were to receive water at the second point of measurement.
Thank you. Would it have been easier on all of us if they had called the parties of the first part, the first point right holders?
I would imagine so.
Thank you. Can we please go to the bottom of page 8 of this document? I'm going to take that back. I take that back. I think I may have meant the party, the bottom of page 7. I'm looking for the list of the, begins with, there we go. Thank you. And we are, just for clarity on the record, we are on page 7, I believe, of the document. Dr. Miltenberger, do you see the paragraph that begins, the said Henry Miller?
Yes.
And all of those parties listed in that paragraph are then designated at the end as the parties of the first part. Do you see that?
No.
Okay. The beginning of the paragraph is the said Henry Miller, Frederick Cox. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then after the slash, it says will be hereinafter designated as the parties of the first part herein. Do you see that?
I do now. Yes.
I'm sorry, I may have been a little unclear. So that list of people between Henry Miller and the slash line were the parties of the first part under the Miller-Hagen agreement. Is that accurate?
Well, I would caveat my answer by saying that this is a legal contract, as I understand it, and I wouldn't be seen as trying to provide an interpretation of the legal opinion. I would say that this list here does end with identifying them as the parties of the first part.
Okay, thank you. And as you said earlier, under this agreement, these were the parties who obtained rights to water at the second point of measurement on the Kern River under this agreement. Is that accurate?
Again, I'm reluctant to use the term right in as much as it has a legal meaning and import here. And I'd use the term entitlement relative to this contract.
Appreciate that. So these are the parties who, using your terms, obtained an entitlement to water at the second point of measurement under the Miller-Hagen agreement. Is that accurate?
Would you please restate the question?
Sure.
Done.
The parties in the list between the said Henry Miller and the Kern Valley Water Company are the parties who obtained an entitlement to water at the second point of measurement under the Miller-Hagen agreement. Is that right?
Yes.
Thank you. And you see Frederick Cox in that list, correct?
Yes,
And it was his successor, Title and Trust, who sued Miller and Lux to exercise entitlements to water from Second Point in the Title and Trust litigation. Is that accurate?
yes.
Can we please go to the bottom of page 11 of Exhibit North Kern 35? It should say fourth in capital letters. You see the first sentence, which I'll read for the record. The parties hereto hereby further agree they will construct or cause to be constructed about Buena Vista Lake a levee so that such lake shall become a reservoir for storing water to be used for irrigating the lands of the party of the first part hereto. You see that sentence?
I do.
And the parties of the first part were the parties who, in your words, obtained an entitlement to water at Second Point of measurement. Is that accurate?
Yes,
And as of 1888, when this document was signed, they included Frederick Cox, correct?
yes.
Okay. Can we please go back to Exhibit Buena Vista 801, which again is excerpts of the transcript of the title insurance and trust case? And can we please go to PDF page 15, which should be transcript page 132. And could we scroll down a little further? Dr. Miltenberger, do you see that beginning at the number 395, this is a typewritten copy of an October 6, 1898 agreement between Miller and Lux and Frederick Cox, among others?
Yes,
As a historian, would you consider this contract to state the intent of the parties as of the date that they signed it?
Objection calls for a legal conclusion.
I'm going to overrule the objection. I think I would like to hear Dr. Miltenberger's answer as a historian, not as a lawyer.
may I have the question again, please?
Certainly. As a historian, would you consider that this contract stated the intent of the parties as of the date they signed it?
I would answer that generally, in as much as oftentimes when I confront such agreements or contracts or documents such as this, I want to know more about the context in which they were drafted. And with specific reference to this one, I think it would be useful for me to review it in its totality.
Okay. Well, I don't want to take up too much time. I'd be happy for you to review it, but I want to ask you a few questions about it. Can we please go down to the next page, transcript page 133? And do you see the first full paragraph that includes Frederick Cox in the first line?
Yes,
Can you please take a moment to review that paragraph?
may we scroll up, please, Ms. Mellon? I finished reading the paragraph.
Thank you. Is it fair to summarize that paragraph as stating that Miller and Lux, Frederick Cox, and Horatio Stebbins all wanted to use water available to them under the Miller-Hagen agreement on their respective lands?
May I reread it with that question in mind?
Sure.
Ms. Mullen, yes, thank you. That's perfect, actually. It's right where we need to be. Would you please repeat the question with that?
Sure. Is it fair to summarize that paragraph as reflecting the intent of Miller and Lux, Frederick Cox, and Horatio Stebbins to all use water available to them under the Miller-Hagen agreement on their respective lands?
I'm not certain if I can tell that just from this paragraph.
Okay. They all signed the contract, correct? All right, take
Yes.
that back. Okay, thank you. Let's look at the next paragraph, or actually 2 down, please. And it probably makes sense to scroll down so Dr. Miltenberger can refer to the next page as well. Well, the paragraph breaks up on transcript pages 133 and 134. Do you see in this paragraph, it describes how someone named Frank McCrae was developing canals for Miller and Lux?
Well, may we go back up
Yes.
here? Okay.
So Miller and Lux was building canals as projected by Frank McCrae at the time, correct?
Yes.
Do you discuss Mr. McCrae's testimony in this title insurance case in your testimony?
Yes.
Does your testimony discuss how Miller and Lux was building canals as projected by Mr. McCrae?
I don't believe I discussed that specifically, no.
Dr. Miltenberger, we don't need to pull it up on the screen, but Dr. Miltenberger, can you please refer to your testimony, exhibit KWBA 1 and paragraph 39? Have you reviewed that paragraph?
I have.
Does that refresh your recollection whether you discussed in your testimony that Miller and Lux was building canals as projected by Mr. McCrae?
Yes.
And were they building canals in that way?
I'm a little confused. When?
Were they building canals as of 1898?
Well, I think as we're looking at from the title insurance piece, yes, there were works being constructed.
Thank you very much. Do you consider the canals that Miller and Lux were building as projected by Mr. McCrae to be a plan for progressive development?
No.
Okay. Turning back to, if we could scroll back to the bottom of page 133. Does this paragraph describe how Miller and Lux was building a canal to the south line of Township 27 South?
It identifies a structure called the main drain canal. I think it the easiest to understand what this is by reference to a map, because I don't have the townships and ranges committed to memory.
Do you see, though, that Mr. McCrae's presented this contract that states that Miller and Lux was in fact building a canal to the south line of Township 27 South? Do you see that?
Well, I just to be clear, I see that as appearing in here. I don't know if I saw at the top if McCrae was presenting this or not, but I do see that the statement there about extending near the south line.
Okay, thank you. Do you know whether that south line of Township 27 South is currently within Buena Vista's Buttonwell service area?
I think so, but again, I would need reference to a map to be assured of my response.
Thank you. Can we please go to transcript page 144, which I believe is the next page? And there should be a paragraph entitled 11th on page 144. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time keeping track of the pages with the with it blown up this big. Okay, so we need to go 9 pages forward from here. So Dr. Miltenberger, do you see that we're now on transcript page 144?
Yes.
Do you see that paragraph entitled 11th?
Yes.
And about halfway down the page, do you see the line that starts each year followed by semicolon?
Yes.
And the proviso beginning provided, does it state that Mr. Cox wanted to take water under an entitlement to second point water other than his lands within Township 27?
Actually, would you read the question? I was reading it.
Sure.
You understand?
The line that begins each year contains the beginning of a proviso, starting with provided. And the remainder of that sentence, does it state that Mr. Cox wanted to take water to serve lands other than lands in Township 27 South?
Well, I guess I'm reading this as that he had to. I'd have to scrutinize more carefully, but the way I read this, he would have to pay a rental for water.
Yes, he would have to pay a rental to take water to lands other than those in Township 27 South. Is that accurate?
Yeah, yes, but maybe scroll a little bit because I see there's another statement here. I just want to be certain that it's starting with the but. Okay, I think there's a little bit more. I just want to get, I think this is all part of that, right? So I want to kind of get it.
Yes.
Can we go to the next page, please? Okay.
So again, the proviso allowed Mr. Cox to take water to his lands other than those in Township 27 South upon paying a rental to Kern Valley Water Company. Is that accurate?
That's how I read this. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And if we're going to be transitioning perhaps to another thing, may we take a short break, Ms. Kinsey?
Mr. Becerra, are you moving from this line of questioning?
I'm just about done with this line of question.
Dr. Mittenberger, can you hang in there for a few more minutes and then we'll have a natural break?
Sure.
I may
I
ask.
apologize, Dr. Miltenberger. I think it's 5 minutes. In this title insurance and trust case, whose transcript we've been reviewing, Mr. Cox's successor, Title Insurance and Trust, sued Miller and Lux to be able to take water they were entitled to at Second Point to their lands. Is that accurate?
That's my recollection of what I testified prior.
And that litigation was ongoing as of December 19th, 1914. Is that accurate?
It's accurate again with the caveat of, I don't know how long the litigation actually lasted, how long the trial lasted. Let me say that.
The trial started in 1913. Is that accurate?
Yes, and I only mean, Mr. Becerra, that I'm not certain of the precise day and time that it started and ended. Not to be difficult, but just I want to be
No,
clear with my answers.
I appreciate the precision. The trial started in 1913. That's accurate, correct?
Yes,
And the California Supreme Court issued its decision in 1920. Is that also accurate?
yes,
And we've been discussing an 1898 contract between Miller and Lux and Frederick Cox, correct?
correct.
Do you discuss the 1898 contract in your testimony?
I do not discuss it, no.
Okay, thank you. We're happy to take a break at this point, Ms. Kinsey. Thank you, Dr.
thank you.
Miltenberger.
Thank you, Mr. Becerra. Thank you, Dr. Miltenberger. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. We will return at 2:10 and resume where we left off. Hello and welcome back. It is 2:11 and we are still in the cross-examination of Dr. Miltenberger. And I will go ahead and turn it back over to you, Mr. Becerra.
Thank you very much. Ms. Mullen, could we pull up Dr. Miltenberger's testimony, exhibit KWBA1, and go back to his paragraph 43? Thank you. Dr. Miltenberger, in this paragraph, you rely on the state's bulletin number 9 as providing the most reliable approximation of acreage within Buena Vista, irrigated acreage within Buena Vista's service area as of or prior to December 19th, 1914, correct?
I believe I previously testified to that, yes.
Thank you. And in this paragraph, you also identify bulletin 9 as having identified an average supply of 150,000 acre feet as being needed to serve those acres, correct?
Well, I think I characterize it, and I rely on what I state here. That's an average annual water supply of roughly 150,000 acre feet. And that was the amount that could possibly irrigate the 43,600.
Okay, thank you. Bulletin 9 also had a supporting 1920 report by Harry Barnes, correct?
I might characterize it a little bit differently in as much as Barnes had charge of the investigation. So it was kind of a preliminary report of sorts that fed into Bulletin 9.
Bulletin 9 relied on Mr. Barnes' 1920 report, correct?
Correct.
And Mr. Barnes' report is your exhibit KWBA 13. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. This average supply of 150,000 acre feet per year, you didn't calculate that from some set of numbers, did you?
No, I did not.
You're repeating what Bulletin 9 said, correct?
Well, I'm presenting what Bulletin 9 offers.
Thank you. Can we please go to Bulletin 9, which is exhibit KWBA 14? Thank you, Ms. Mullen. And I'd like to go to page 53, which is PDF page 60. And down to the bottom paragraph. Dr. Miltenberger, Dr. Miltenberger, do you see that in this paragraph, Bulletin 9 generally described how Second Point water was stored in Buena Vista Lake Reservoir?
Yes, it identifies it as part of the available supply can be diverted into Buena Vista Lake.
And the first sentence discusses how that water could be carried over for following seasons, correct?
No, I don't believe it's saying that at all. What it's saying is to extend the period use of the waters. And I think as other statements make clear in Bulletin 9, even just going down at the very below, the figures indicate a broad, shallow nature of this reservoir. I think Bulletin 9 was concluding that there offers information that shows there wasn't substantial carryover storage from year to year.
Okay, can we please go to page 65, which I believe should be PDF page 72. I think. Dr. Miltenberger, do you see this table 26 from bulletin 9?
I do.
Do you see that this table states that it computes inflow, outflow, and evaporation for Buena Vista Lake?
Yes, for a period from 1911 to 1918, based on gauge height readings.
And you anticipated my question. Thank you. That period 1911 through 1918 overlapped the date December 19th, 1914 you use in your testimony, correct?
Yes.
Okay, let's look at the table. Do you see over to the left at the top, there's a heading season March 1st to February 28th?
Yes.
Okay. And can you go down to the line 1912 to 1913?
I'm there.
Okay. And do you see the column headed water in lake at beginning of season acre feet?
Yes.
You see that column for that line states 152,500 acre feet?
Yes.
Do you understand this to mean that Buena Vista Lake Reservoir held 152,500 acre feet as of March 1st, 1912?
Generally speaking, but I would say that there's additional text that allows for an interpretation of table 26 that appears in page 60, I believe on page 64. And I also want to be careful that I'm not offering an engineering opinion or a technical opinion on the figures presented here or the analysis itself.
First, move to strike is non-responsive. The question was simply whether that column and table indicates that 152,500 acre feet were held in Buena Vista Lake as of March 1st, 1912.
And I'd one, like to get a ruling on Mr. Becerra's motion to strike Ms. Kenzie, and two, I'd like to interpose an objection that one, the document speaks for itself, and two, the continued questions for hours about what a document says is unduly cumulative and a waste of time.
Let me make sure I go through this step by step. I'm going to overrule the motion to strike. I mean, it is non-responsive, but I could ask the question myself and get the answer. I will direct Dr. Miltenberger to answer the question. We'll get back to that. Mr. Bivens, as you can anticipate, your objection is overruled. Dr. Miltenberger's testimony is extensive, and it does include excerpts from technical documents. So I think it is appropriate here for Mr. Becerra to question him in a fair amount of detail about some of these matters and what he did or didn't consider. So I'm going to allow it to go forward. I'm going to turn it back to you, Mr. Becerra, because I think after all that, it would be appropriate to restate the question, and then we will have Dr. Miltenberger answer it.
Thank you. Dr. Miltenberger, for the year 1912 to 1913, do you see that in the column headed water in lake at beginning of season acre feet, it states 152,500 acre feet?
I see that statement, yes.
Do you understand that to mean that as of March 1st, 1912, Buena Vista Lake Reservoir held 152,500 acre feet of water?
Yes, based upon the gauge height readings.
Thank you. Going down to the next line from 1913 to 1914, you see in that same column the number 44,000 acre feet.
Yes.
Do you understand that to mean that as of March 1st, 1913, Buena Vista Lake Reservoir held 44,000 acre feet of water?
Yes, but again, I think that this table needs to be read in concert with the paragraph that discusses or places some of this information into a deeper context. And that appears on page, I believe, page 64, just preceding this one.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm trying to economize. If your counsel would like to ask about that, certainly they can on redirect. So Dr. Miltenberger, the difference between the 1912 to 1913 number of 152,500 acre feet and the 1913 to 1914 number of 44,000 acre feet, some of that water could have been delivered for irrigation, correct?
It could have been. I'm not certain if I could make that out precisely from this table.
Okay, thank you. Let's go down to the next line, 1914 to 1915. Do you see in that same column, it states 28,000 acre feet?
Yes.
Do you understand that as of March 1st, 1914, Buena Vista Lake Reservoir held 28,000 acre feet of water?
Yes.
And do you see the next line, 1915 to 1916, in that same column?
Yes.
Do you see that in that column, it states 175,700 acre feet?
I see that figure.
That difference between the March 1st, 1914 number, 28,000, and the March 1st, 1915 number of 175,700, the difference is 147,700 acre feet. Is that accurate?
I'd have to sit and tabulate it. I don't know off the top of my head.
Does it appear to be about 48,000 acre feet to you?
The difference between the two numbers?
Yeah, 148,000 acre feet, roughly.
Yes.
Do you understand this to mean that between March 1st, 1914 and March 1st, 1915, Miller and Lux diverted approximately 147,000 acre feet of water at least into Buena Vista Lake Reservoir?
Again, I would say that, well, a couple things. Response, Mr. Becerra. First of all, I think I would be very skeptical of the simple math that's being presented here relative to the operations of the reservoir. I mean, as we go across on the columns, as you can see, Ms. Kinsey, there's figures for evaporation from the reservoir as well that could very well account for the difference in numbers. And again, I would go back to page 64, I believe it's page 64 again, which places into some context what this table shows. And ideally, I think to answer that question would require more of a technical analysis precisely of what all these figures mean. And I think page 64 may provide some of that, but then a water resources engineer could best address some of those. So I can't say for sure that that simple math amounts to what was actually diverted or used for irrigation. Again, in as much as this table also presents figures for evaporative losses.
Again, motion to strike is non-responsive. I asked Dr. Miltenberger about some simple numbers.
I'm overruled. I think it's fair for Dr. Miltenberger to frame the limits on any testimony he's providing in response to these questions. So
Thank you. Dr. Miltenberger, is it your testimony we should be skeptical of the numbers contained in Bulletin 9?
Absolutely not.
But you think we should be skeptical of these numbers in Bulletin 9? Is that correct?
Objection, argumentative.
overruled.
No, that's not what I'm saying, Mr. Becerra. What I'm saying is we're looking at one column and doing a very simple math calculation when the table presents additional information that I think would be necessary to place into context those numbers, not the least of which the amount of water that was lost to evaporation. And again, as a historian, I'd rely on the explanation, the context that's presented on page 64 for some of this table that allows us, I think, perhaps to better understand what these figures are getting at. So I'm not saying the numbers are unreliable. What I'm saying is the conclusions that are being drawn from the simple arithmetic, to me, I'm skeptical of, and I don't think capture the information that's presented here.
So let's turn to that column you called out, the estimated evaporation. Do you see that column headed estimated total acre feet of evaporation?
I do.
For the 1914 to 1915 season, do you see that it's 93,100 acre feet?
Yes.
So do you think it's possible that 93,100 acre feet of water evaporated from Buena Vista Lake Reservoir during that season?
Yes, I think that's what the column is getting at.
And then on March 1st, 1915, this table indicates there was nonetheless 175,700 acre feet of water stored in Buena Vista Lake Reservoir, correct?
That is the figure that's given.
And that 1914 to 1915 season overlaps the date December 19th, 1914, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Let's pull up exhibit KWBA 13. Please, Ms. Mullen. Thank you. We can start there. Dr. Miltenberger, do you recognize this document as your exhibit KWBA 13?
Yes.
And this is Mr. Barnes' 1920 report, correct?
Correct.
Did this report support the state's preparation of Bulletin 9?
Yes.
Can we please go to PDF page 21, which is page 16 of this exhibit? And can we scroll down? Yes, so we can see that entire paragraph beginning grain lands. Thank you. Dr. Miltenberger, is it fair to summarize this paragraph as stating that grain crops within what is now Buena Vista's service area depended chiefly on Buena Vista Lake storage for their irrigation?
That's one of the sentences in there. Yes.
Do you have any reason to doubt that Mr. Barnes got that right?
So I don't quite understand that question.
You have relied on this report and in your own testimony, correct?
Yes.
Do you generally accept what it says to be accurate?
Yes.
Thank you. On this page, do you see in that same paragraph that Mr. Barnes stated the total grain land was only not more than 25% of the acreage normally planted?
That's correct.
And he's speaking about acreage planted in 1920, correct?
During the 1920 season, correct.
Yes. So Mr. Barnes is stating in this paragraph that only about 25% of the land was planted because Buena Vista Lake storage was lacking. Is that accurate?
As I read it, the total of grain land thus shown was probably not more than 25% of the acreage normally planted to grain this year, the deficiency being due to a shortage of water. And then it goes on to say the lack of adequate storage in the reservoir, such as obtained this year, meant that only so much grain was planted as could be irrigated directly from the spring flow of the river.
Thank you. Can we go to the preceding page, which is page 15 of the report, please, Ms. Mullen? Thank you. Dr. Miltenberger, do you see the table there on this page with the different classes of land?
Yes.
And on the line for class 4, do you see that contains the largest number of acres in the table? Among
Yes.
the classes of. Do you see on further under the heading crop, Mr. Barnes characterized grain as including corn?
Yes.
Does this indicate to you that Mr. Barnes determined that there was corn being grown within Buena Vista's service area in 1920?
I believe he states that, yes.
Thank you. Can we go back to Exhibit Buena Vista 801, which is the excerpts of the transcript of the title insurance case? Thank you, Ms. Mullen. And I'm looking to go to PDF page 119, which is transcript page 573. Do you see that, excuse me, Dr. Miltenberger?
I do.
Okay, can we go to the bottom of the page where we see James Ogden's name, please? Dr. Miltenberger, do you recall that this was Mr. Ogden's testimony in the 1913 trial in the title insurance case?
Yes.
And do you recall he was the superintendent of Miller and Lux's ranches at the time?
Yes.
Can we please go to the next page, which is transcript page 574? Thank you, Ms. Mullen. Can we go about halfway down the page to the line that begins during the time? Dr. Miltenberger, do you see that line during the time that I have been in the employ?
I do.
Can you please read through, just for your own sake to familiarize yourself, read that sentence through to the end that sometimes is done?
I finished reading.
Is it accurate to summarize that sentence as Mr. Ogden testifying in a 1913 trial that Miller and Lux sometimes turned practically all of the river into the reservoir?
That's what the sentence says. I recall from other parts of his testimony, though, that he indicates that water was bypassed or let go.
Understood. You did not cite his testimony in your testimony, correct?
I did not.
Thank you. Can we go a little further down the page? There's another sentence that begins during the time. I believe it's below the number 1722. In the line just below 1722. During the time that, do you see that, Dr. Miltenberger?
I do.
Can you read, just for your own sake, that sentence through to the end, irrigation below?
I finished reading it.
Thank you. Is it fair to summarize Mr. Ogden's testimony here in the 1913 trial that Miller and Lux was governed by the regulation of water they needed for irrigation?
And what they expected to come.
Yes. What they expected to come into the reservoir, is that accurate?
I don't necessarily read that sentence that way, considering the sentence above says we can turn it into the reservoir or turn it directly into the property to the north. I don't read that sentence as being exclusively putting in the reservoir, but rather that they would make decisions based upon what they expected to come and the necessity for irrigation.
So is it your understanding that sometimes Miller and Lux would divert water directly out of the river for irrigation? Is that right? Is that your understanding?
Yes.
And then sometimes they would divert water into Buena Vista Lake Reservoir for subsequent irrigation. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
Thank you. Can we please go to page 585 of the transcript, which I believe is PDF page 131. Could be wrong. Thank you, Ms. Mullen. You got it absolutely right. Thank you. you still recognize that this is Mr. Ogden's trial testimony?
I think so, although it looks like it begins with Mr. Treadwell.
Do you understand Mr. Treadwell was one of the attorneys involved in the case?
Yes,
So he asked a question and then there was an answer, correct?
yes.
And it would have been Mr. Ogden giving the answer, correct?
Well, I most likely, although again, I would kind of need to see the index to see precisely how it was this. Is this the page immediately after the
Would
one
you-
we were just looking at?
Well, why don't we refer to the index so you can confirm? Ms. Mullen, can we please go to PDF page 7 for the index? And could we scroll down a little more until we see Mr. Ogden's name? Thank you. Dr. Miltenberger, do you see that Mr. Ogden's testimony is on page 585 of the transcript?
Oh, yes, I can see that. I guess it would proceed right before 586, where he was under cross.
Thank you. So could we please go back to page 585, which I believe is PDF page 131? Thank you very much. And could we scroll down to the bottom of the page, please? Do you see the last full sentence on the page? I'll read it for the record. Water can be and is in high years held over in the Buena Vista Lake Reservoir from 1 year to the next. Do you see that testimony, Dr. Miltenberger?
Yes,
Would you consider this testimony to be consistent with Bulletin 9's Table 26 concerning how water was stored in Buena Vista Lake Reservoir?
no, not necessarily. And again, as I mentioned, I know from the Ogden testimony that he also makes reference to water that they could not hold. And I think Bulletin 9 and even Mr. Barnes provides some information that suggests that water wasn't held over from year to year. Or even if there was some manner of water that was held over from year to year, it couldn't be used.
Thank you. Dr. Miltenberger, the last sentence on the page here, water can be and is in high years held over in the Buena Vista Lake Reservoir from 1 year to the next. That is Mr. Ogden's testimony in a 1913 trial, correct?
Correct.
And at the time, he was Miller and Lux's superintendent of its Kern County ranches, correct?
Correct.
Thank you. Can we please go to transcript page 594, which is PDF page 140, I believe? And go down to the, if we could please go down to the second paragraph, which begins, "We aim." They're long paragraphs, unfortunately. Thank you. Dr. Miltenberger, I'm sorry to do this to you, but can you please review that paragraph so you can familiarize yourself with its contents?
Ms. Mullen, will you please scroll down a bit more? Maybe we could use scroll down, please. Thank you. Would you please continue? Thank you. Would you please go back up now? Back up to the top, if you would, at the start of the paragraph.
Have you read it sufficiently, Dr. Miltenberger?
Yes, I believe so.
Thank you. Is it fair to say that in this paragraph, Mr. Ogden testified that Miller and Lux filled Buena Vista Lake Reservoir with river flows in multiple years before 1914?
I'm not sure if I necessarily characterize as multiple. He identifies 1906 and 1907. In 1906, as I testified, was a year in which there was considerable water that was passed out of the reservoir because it was in flood. The river was in flood. But he identifies 1906, 1907 as filled. There was water up in 1910, I think could be read as being full, but that's just that's 3 years. I don't know if I wouldn't necessarily characterize that as multiple, just based solely on this testimony.
So is your understanding that at least in 3 years prior to 1914, Miller and Lux filled Buena Vista Lake Reservoir with flows from the Kern River? Do you understand that?
Well, I say according to Mr. Ogden's testimony, yes. And I think there's additional important context, which is, as he describes it later on, that in 1913, there's water in it now, but it is so low that we cannot draw it out. And I think that may also account for potentially maybe even that table with the gauge height readings. I mean, there's going to be some water because the elevation of the outlet canal for the lake was higher than the bottom of the lake itself. So
thank you. Appreciate the clarification. Is it your understanding that in this 1913 trial, Mr. Ogden, Miller and Lux's superintendent of its Kern County ranches, testified that in at least 3 years before 1914, Miller and Lux filled the reservoir from Kern River flows? Is that your understanding?
Objection, asked and answered.
Overruled. I don't think he did answer it, or I missed it. So please answer the question, Dr. Miltenberger.
Mr. Becerra, would you please restate the question?
Sure. Do you understand this paragraph, which is testimony from James Ogden, Miller and Lux's Kern County Ranches superintendent, in a 1913 trial, to state that in at least 3 years before 1914, Miller and Lux filled the reservoir from Kern River flows?
Yes, I believe that's what Mr. Ogden's testifying.
Thank you. And you did not cite Mr. Ogden's testimony in your testimony, correct?
No, I didn't.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to your testimony, Exhibit KWBA1, and paragraph 33 on what I believe is PDF page 24. Thank you, Ms. Mullen. Exactly. In that first sentence, Dr. Miltenberger, you testify that while Henry Miller was the company president, the company focused on livestock and meat packing operations, correct?
Well, I think just to be clear for the record, the full statement is, as these studies suggest, referring back to the USDA studies I discussed as well as others. There is little historical evidence that during Miller's tenure as company president, roughly 1889 through 1914, Miller and Lux sought to alter its land and water use practices or pursue changes to its irrigation system that would expand its water use beyond its needs to support its livestock and meatpacking operations.
Thank you. Can we go down to PDF page 31 and Dr. Miltenberger's paragraph 43? Thank you. And again, Dr. Miltenberger, in the first sense of this paragraph, you state your opinion that Bulletin 9 offers the most reliable approximation of the acreage irrigated in the Buena Vista service area prior to December 19th, 1914, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Can we please pull up Dr. Miltenberger's exhibit KWBA 13, which is the Barnes report? Dr. Miltenberger, you rely on this report in your testimony, correct?
Correct.
Did Bulletin 9 also rely on this report?
Yes.
Can we please go to PDF page 22, which is page 17 of the report? Thank you. And Dr. Miltenberger, do you see the heading Farm Holdings?
Yes.
And do you see the second paragraph of the Miller and Lux lands?
Yes.
Does that paragraph indicate that tenant farmers were farming part of Miller and Lux's lands within the Buena Vista service area as of the time of Mr. Barnes' report?
It does.
Do you know how much of Buena Vista's service area was being farmed by tenants at that time?
Not that I can recall offhand, or maybe that I know.
Okay, thank you. Can we scroll down to the next paragraph, which begins these tenants? Dr. Miltenberger, do you understand that this paragraph states Mr. Barnes's conclusions that tenants were operating under sharecropping arrangements with Miller and Lux at that time?
They were operating under annual lease agreements in which they would give Miller and Lux 1/3 of the crops produced and 1/2 of the wild or volunteer hay.
So at the time Mr. Barnes was reporting in 1920, Miller and Lux was receiving 1/3 of the crops of its tenants within what is now the Buena Vista service area, correct?
Correct.
And the second sentence of that paragraph states that the company provides the land and water. Do you understand that the company was Miller and Lux?
Yes.
So Miller and Lux was providing the water to its tenants to grow crops in the Buena Vista service area as of 1920, correct?
Correct.
And you don't have an understanding as to how much of that service area was being farmed by tenants at the time, do you?
No, I don't. Not that I recall if I've seen it.
Okay, thank you. Can we please go down to PDF page 27, which should be page 22 of this report? Thank you, Ms. Mullen. You see the first paragraph under the heading Maintenance of Canals?
Yes.
And that that first sentence discusses main canals. Your testimony discusses those main canals. Is that accurate?
Yes,
The next sentence on Exhibit 13 discusses laterals. Do you see that?
yes,
Do you see that old residents apparently stated that the tenants had constructed those laterals? Do you see that?
yes,
And do you see that they apparently stated that those laterals were constructed by tenants, quote, many years ago?
that's what's stated there, yes.
And those many years ago would have been before Mr. Barnes was reporting in 1920, correct?
Presumably, I don't know if, certainly from this statement, what many means is a little vague, but presumably.
Your testimony does not discuss the construction of lateral canals within what is Buena Vista's service area by Miller and Lux's tenants, does it?
No,
Thank you. Can we go down to the third paragraph on this page, which begins, the laterals are chiefly maintained? And I'll read that for the record. The laterals are chiefly maintained by the tenant farmer, each man caring for the ditches that traverse the land he has leased. Do you see that?
yes,
Do you understand that to mean Miller and Lux's tenants as of 1920 were in charge of maintaining the laterals within what is now Buena Vista's service area?
that they were chiefly maintained by the tenant farmer, yes.
Thank you. Can we please go to page 23 of Mr. Barnes' report, the next page? And can we scroll down to the heading Operation of Canal System? Thank you. Do you see the second sentence under that heading, Dr. Miltenberger?
Second sentence beginning on the laterals.
On the laterals. Do you see that sentence? And I'll read it for the record for ease of reference. On the laterals, the custom is for the irrigators to arrange their own schedules, taking the water in turn along the ditch or trading among themselves as most convenient. Do you see that sentence?
Yes,
Do you understand that sentence to mean that Miller and Lux's tenants were managing deliveries from the laterals themselves as of 1920?
I'd read it that way.
Okay, thank you. Your testimony in Exhibit KWBA1 contains no discussion of Miller and Lux's tenants regulating supplies from the laterals as of 1920, correct?
Correct.
And you rely on Bulletin 9, which was supported by Mr. Barnes' report, as the best approximation of acreage irrigated in Buena Vista's service area before December 19th, 1914, correct?
I think I've testified to that on several occasions, yes.
Okay, thank you. I've reached the end of this line of questioning. If Dr. Miltenberger, if you'd like to take a break, or Ms. Kinsey, if you'd like to take a break, this would be a good moment.
I would appreciate one.
All right, Dr. Miltenberger, you're on the hot seat, so we will grant you that. Let's take a 10-minute break. It is now 2:55. We'll return at 3:05.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we're back. Let's go back on the record. I see Dr. Miltenberger here. I see Mr. Becerra. So let's go ahead. Mr. Becerra, you may continue your cross-examination.
Thank you very much. Could we please pull up exhibit KWBA 14, which is the state's bulletin 9? And could we please go to PDF page 60, which should be page 53 of the document? Dr. Miltenberger, do you see the last paragraph on the page that begins "to extend"?
Yes,
Is it fair to summarize that sentence as bulletin 9 stating that water was stored in Buena Vista Lake to carry over water into following seasons?
well, it says both during any season and for carrying water for following seasons. That part of the available supply can be diverted into Buena Vista Lake.
And that supply is identified in the sentence as waters received at second point. Is that accurate?
Yes,
And again, bulletin 9 was published by the state in 1920, correct?
actually, I believe it was published in 1921.
21, my apologies. At that time, the state recognized that water was being diverted into Buena Vista Lake Reservoir to carry over water into following seasons, correct?
Yeah, part of the available supply.
Thank you. Can we please go to PDF page 71, which is the page 64 Dr. Miltenberger discussed earlier? And just for reference, can we scroll down to the next page, page 65, so we all have the context? And Dr. Miltenberger, this table 26 is the table we discussed earlier, correct?
Yes,
And at that time, you referenced the previous page, page 64, right?
I did.
Okay, can we please go back up to page 64? Do you see the line that begins Reservoir Association?
Yes,
The sentence that the words Reservoir Association are in describes how a record of gauge heights at Buena Vista Lake Reservoir were obtained for periods between 1911 and 1918, correct?
yeah, specifically at about weekly intervals during the summer months from 1911 to 1918.
And the following sentence states, with these, the inflow, evaporation, and draft were computed. Do you see that sentence?
Yes,
Do you understand the word draft to mean the amount of water diverted out of storage in Buena Vista Lake Reservoir?
I think it could mean that. I don't see it clearly defined in the sentence you're pointing me towards.
Okay, thank you. So continuing on in that paragraph, you see the sentence, the summary for each year is given in table 26.
Yes,
And do you see references to water being carried over in the lake later in that paragraph?
Yes, it carried over only small amounts in 1914 and 1915.
It carried water over, correct?
Only small amounts.
It carried water over, correct?
It carried water over, but again, as I was explaining earlier, the question may be whether or not how usable this water was, given if it was at an elevation that was lower than the outlet gates. So whether it could not be, the question of whether it could be used or not is outstanding.
Thank you. Can we scroll down to the next page in that table 26 again, please? And we discussed this previously, but in the column water in lake beginning at beginning of season acre feet, you see for the line 1915 to 1916, it states 175,700 acre feet.
I see that figure, yes.
And that's the volume of water that the state calculated was available in Buena Vista Lake Reservoir as of March 1st, 1915, correct?
Correct.
And the preceding season, 1914 to 1915, started with 28,000 acre feet in storage on March 1st, 1914, correct?
Correct.
So just basic numbers, between March 1st, 1914 and March 1st, 1915, the lake's storage rose from 28,000 acre feet to 175,700 acre feet, correct?
Well, there is that delta, but again, I don't think I'm qualified to fully assess what that delta represents.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Can we please go to page 36 of this document, which I believe should be PDF page 41. Oh, I was mistaken. Looks like it's PDF page 43. Dr. Miltenberger, do you see that this chapter of Bulletin 9 is entitled Present Irrigation from Kern River?
Yes.
Can we please go to the next page, which would be page 37 of the document? Thank you. Dr. Miltenberger, do you see the paragraph that begins some modifications?
Yes.
And it refers to this contract. Do you understand that that's the Miller-Hagan agreement?
Well, I think I need to scroll back up to read what came before it.
Certainly.
Okay, we could scroll to the next page, please.
So that first full paragraph that begins some modifications, do you understand that reference to this contract to mean the Miller-Hagan agreement?
Yes.
And that paragraph is and if you need to read it, certainly feel free. But is it fair to summarize that paragraph as describing how the first point and second point interests would informally exchange water before 1920?
Yes, it describes exchanges.
And I'm sorry, let me withdraw. Is it fair to say that paragraph accurately summarizes that sometimes second point interest would allow first point interest to divert their water and then get water back from first point later?
Yes, it looks like it identifies the context for it. It looks to identify to address issues with losses in conveyance.
And because of those, sometimes second point interest would allow first point interest to divert their water, correct?
Yes, some delivery of second point water through canals diverting above second point have also been practiced in order to reduce river losses.
And then is it fair to summarize that as stating that then later second point interest would get water back from first point interest?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to go back to your testimony, exhibit KWBA1, and specifically paragraph 33, which should be on PDF page 24. And this is just to confirm, in this paragraph, Dr. Miltenberger, you describe how you reviewed the Miller and Lux records at UC Berkeley's Bancroft Library. Is that accurate?
Yes.
And in that paragraph, you state the company, that means Miller and Lux, I assume. Is that accurate?
Yes.
It states the company remains steadfast in its commitment to raising livestock feed and utilize the same flood irrigation techniques as it has since the 1880s to do so. Do you see that sentence?
Yes.
Is that as of 1914 is what the company's intent was at the time, in your opinion?
I don't know if I understand the question.
The statement is the company remains steadfast. Is that tied to a particular time?
Yes, I think given the section in which this appears, I think to say the company remained steadfast in its commitment to livestock and utilizing the same flood irrigation practices since the 1880s carries through into the 1914.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to bring up exhibit Buena Vista 637. Thank you, Ms. Mullen. And Dr. Miltenberger, if you need to scroll through this exhibit to understand what it is, I certainly understand.
I think I do, and we might begin with how many pages is this?
I believe it's 18.
Ms. Mullen, will you scroll to the first page, please? Or perhaps then the second page.
Dr. Miltenberger, do you understand that this document came from the Bancroft Library's collection of Miller and Lux records?
I do. Ms. Mullen, would you please go to the next page? Okay, and the next page? The next page after that, if you would. Okay, so this looks like, this PDF looks like it consists of at least three documents. I think I would need to read through all of them to understand how they interrelate. Would it be possible to print these and review them?
Well, I'd like
Or
to
go
ask
through
you
them
about them and
individually?
then, I mean, certainly review them. If you'd like to continue scrolling through, we can. Let me ask you though, do you recognize these documents as having come from the Bancroft Library's collection of Miller and Lux records?
Yes, I do recognize them. It's coming from the Bancroft Library.
Thank you. Can we please go to PDF page 4? Dr. Miltenberger, do you recognize this document as an internal Miller and Lux memorandum concerning sales of water from Buena Vista Lake to at least 3 oil companies as of May 5th, 1911?
Ms. Mullen, actually, would you go to the page before this? I want to try to understand the context. Okay, would you please go to the return to the page we were at? Oh, actually, would you go to the next page? As it turned out, you were anticipating where I wanted to ask. Oh, I'm sorry, I meant the next page after this one, please, scrolling down. Okay, would you actually go back to the next page, the one we were previously on? Oh, sorry, perhaps I misspoke. No, I think going back up. Well, I have to scrutinize it further, but it does seem to be some form of correspondence from some form of internal correspondence. Again, I would need to, I think, review the documents in and around this to fully appreciate and understand what this document is saying, or what it could convey, the information it can convey.
You reviewed Miller and Lux records at the UC Berkeley Bancroft Library, correct?
Yes.
You cited some of them in your testimony. Is that accurate?
That's accurate.
You don't cite this document in your testimony from the Bancroft Library, do you?
No.
Does this document, which is the May 5th, 1911 Miller and Lux report, I believe it's signed on the following page. It appears to show that Miller and Lux was selling water out of Buena Vista Lake Reservoir to oil companies as of 1911, correct?
Well, as I explained, Mr. Becerra, I would need to review the documents before and after this. It looks like this is an entire file, and it's oftentimes the best way to understand or appreciate any one document is to understand the documents that come before and after it. I don't know if there's some additional context that might explain what precisely this is being offered here. I can't tell from what I'm seeing. Ideally, I'd want to see the entire file, all the material that come before it and potentially materials that come after it. So I could not say without studying the file in greater depth.
You had access to the entirety of the Miller and Lux records at the Bancroft Library for purposes of preparing your testimony, correct?
That's a rather expansive way of putting it. I certainly had access to the Miller and Lux records, but we've established they're quite large. It's a quite large collection. I did not purport, and nor do I think my testimony suggests that I saw absolutely every document within the Miller and Lux collection.
Is it possible there's materials in that collection that are relevant to your testimony that you have not reviewed?
Well, Mr. Becerra, it's very possible for any historian for that to be true. There's new collections being discovered frequently. There's information, new ways of reading documents at any given time. I don't think any historian would give testimony saying they saw absolutely everything necessary for the interpretation that they're offering. That's just too expansive and global a bar.
Okay. This file of materials is not cited in your testimony, correct?
I think I testified to
Asked
that.
an answer. He beat me to it.
Sustained.
Can we please go back to Dr. Miltenberger's testimony, KWBA 1, paragraph 33 on page 24. And you state in the sentence beginning on line 7, examination of Miller and Lux corporate records deposited at the Bancroft Library likewise did not uncover evidence of any such plan or proposal for progressive development. So did you review the entirety of the corporate records in the Bancroft Library before making this statement?
No, and I don't think that that statement was intended to convey the impression that I had. Merely that I pursued a research strategy, and in that research strategy, in reviewing the Miller and Lux records, I found no evidence of this plan or proposal. Every historian has to adopt a research approach, a way of dealing with a large collection of documents and vetting those documents and placing them into conversation, and making judgments about the most credible source material. I don't think any historian would claim to have seen every last scrap of paper relating to their topic, nor every scrap of paper with any given collection. And that was not the impression that was intended to be conveyed by this statement. Rather, again, that I pursued a research strategy based upon my prior experience in researching pre-14 riparian water rights in California, or historical investigations of water rights claims in California. And that search, based upon my experience, did not yield that information.
So your sentence here on lines 7 through 9 in paragraph 33 of your testimony is intended to say your research strategy did not uncover any evidence of a plan or proposal for progressive development in the Miller and Lux records, correct?
I wouldn't quite say it that way. What I would say is I pursued a research strategy. That examination did not yield the information that would be of this plan or proposal for development. I wouldn't say, I think I wouldn't quite characterize it that way. Merely that throughout I've adopted a research strategy, a research approach, as any historian would.
Thank you. Can we please pull up Exhibit Buena Vista 801? Please, this is the transcript on appeal from the title insurance case. And Dr. Miltenberger, I'm going to be asking you about page 603. So let me please go to the index, which is PDF page 7. And if we could scroll down, please. And Dr. Miltenberger, do you see that transcript page 603 would be testimony of James Ogden?
Yes.
Thank you. Can we please go to PDF page 149, which should be transcript page 603? And if we can scroll down to just below the number 1808. Do you see where Mr. Ogden testified beginning with the sentence "in a general way"?
Actually, can we expand out? I'd like to start from the top.
Certainly. Ms. Mon, can we scroll a little bit further down so Dr. Miltenberger can see the page number? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mazzara. I'm sorry, Ms. Mazzara, was there a particular spot you asked me to stop or to direct my attention?
Yes, thank you. Below the number 1808, there's a sentence that begins "in a general way." Do you see that?
Yes,
And from there, there's that sentence, there's the next sentence that begins the sales, and then there's the following sentence that begins the purchaser. Do you see those sentences?
yes,
Is it fair to say that in this 1913 testimony provided by Mr. Ogden as Miller and Lux's Kern County Ranches Superintendent, he describes how Miller and Lux sold water to oil companies from Buena Vista Lake Reservoir?
yes,
You did not cite Mr. Ogden's testimony in your testimony, correct?
Objection, asked and answered.
Sustained.
Thank you. I have no further questions for Dr. Miltenberger.
Thank you, Mr. Becerra. At this point, I will turn to the room and ask once again whether any of the other parties have cross-examination questions for Dr. Miltenberger. I think what makes sense at this point, hearing none, I think we should take just a very brief break. I know it's recent. I'd just like to take 6 minutes until 3:40. I'm going to consider whether I have any questions for Dr. Miltenberger and just organize myself. And then I will look to you, Mr. Bivens, as to whether you have redirect for Dr. Miltenberger.
And if I may offer a friendly suggestion, perhaps we
Please.
can make the break a little bit longer.
Longer so you can decide what you want to do. That makes
Thank
sense. How much time do you need, Mr.
Thank you.
Bivens?
I think 15 minutes would be sufficient.
Okay, so it's 3:35. We'll come back at 3:50 and we will proceed from there.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you in 15 minutes.
Thank you.
All right, it's 3:51. I see Dr. Miltenberger, I see Mr. Bivens, I see Mr. Becerra. So I think we're here. I do have, after looking at some of my notes, I do have a couple of questions for you, Dr. Miltenberger. Mr. Bivens, you should feel free if I ask a muddled question or a compound question and you think your witness needs help, don't be shy to jump in.
It would
I won't
have to be
offended.
pretty bad.
I will try my best to elicit what I'm looking for as quickly as possible. And then after that, I will turn it over to you for any redirect that you may have. So thank you. First of all, thank you, Dr. Miltenberger, for spending so much time with us today. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your work. And I appreciate the fact that there are professional historians in the world. So thank you.
Thank you.
I had a couple of questions and I will do my best to articulate them in a way that you can answer them. I'm looking at your written testimony. So maybe if we can pull up KWBA 1, Ms. Mullins, on page, I'm not sure the PDF page, but it's going to be paragraph 23 of the testimony, which is indicated on the testimony as page 16, but it may be, I don't know if that's a PDF page or not. I'm not as organized as Mr. Becerra. So I'm looking for, let's go to the next page. I'm looking for the rest of paragraph 23. Thank you. Perfect. So Dr. Miltenberger, I had questions here. It's coming back to many of the issues I've already talked about, so humor me if you will. In this last sentence in this paragraph, starting with cropping and irrigate, no, I'm sorry, despite later claims. So it's about, here we go. It's in the middle of our page here. Despite later claims by Miller and Lux officials that the company irrigated nearly 70,000 acres in the Kern River Basin, independent engineering assessments pre and post 1914 indicate that the irrigated acreage within the present day BVWSD service area was likely less, closer to 44,000 acres. And I understand this number 44,000 acres is consistent with your, I believe it's later testimony that we looked at it, it's paragraph 33, where'd it go? Oh no, that's not it. But that the 1920 report or 1922 report was the most accurate, in your opinion, the most accurate representation of the irrigated acreage?
Bulletin 9, which was from an
Thank you.
investigation, went from 1919 to 1920, but the actual report itself wasn't produced until 1921.
Thank you. I didn't get it either. I was in between what I said. Thank you. I knew the document. All right. Do you have any sense, based on your historical research and your professional opinion, did you get any sense as to why the Miller and Lux officials later claimed that the company irrigated nearly 70,000 acres?
Oh, yes, I did. And I think it can be explained simply this way. Miller and Lux were not conceptualizing. They had no sense at this time of what a future water storage district would look like or what its boundaries would be constituted by. I think it's really important to understand, Ms. Kinsey, and this is something that may get lost through the sands of time, but the Miller and Lux holdings were exceedingly large. There's probably apocryphal story or tale that Henry Miller could ride from Mexico to Canada and never leave lands that he owned. But it gets to an essential truth, which is that their holdings were quite large. And even getting into the Kern River area, they conceptualized or organized the company, certainly by the late 19th, early 20th century, by divisions. So the southern division of Miller and Lux's holdings was something on the order of, if I recall correctly, I believe it's in my testimony. Give me a moment, I can give it to you. Yes, so the southern division holdings encompassed 160,000 acres, and that was lands between Bakersfield and Tulare Lake, and that's lands within the basin and lands that ultimately weren't part of Buena Vista Water Storage District. And so that's the point I'm making here is when Miller and Lux were giving their estimates, they're thinking of their totality of their holdings in the area. And so references to the Miller and Lux ranches, well, there were multiple ranches within the southern division. And this is why I started out, Ms. Kinsey, by saying it's very important to be attentive to location because of how vast the holdings are. So it's not so much that I'm suggesting that Miller and Lux were somehow inflating their numbers, but rather that we have to look to what was irrigated within the service area. That was the focus of my research, not looking at the totality of the Miller and Lux holdings in the southern San Joaquin Valley.
Thank you. That's extremely helpful because that clarifies a lot. So I appreciate that. So in this, in your review, I think here in paragraph 24, if you can scroll down, Ms. Mullins, just a bit, where you provide information stating that Miller and Lux's property at that time, which was in the 1880s and 1890s, had swelled to nearly 75,000 acres. And then in 1889 and 1894, the company acquired some additional lands to expand to nearly 80,000 acres. Is that is acreage that is within the present day service area of Buena Vista Water District?
Generally, but that 80,000 encompasses lands north of Wasco Road, say, that we talked about were not part of the district, and other lands elsewhere.
Okay. So it wouldn't be an appropriate comparison to compare this 44,000 acres of irrigated acreage with the number of total holdings of 80,000 acres. That's not an apples to apples. I don't know. That's not even the right term, but that we're talking about potentially different acreages.
Correct.
Ms. Kinsey, if I
Yes.
might clarify.
Sure. I mean, don't testify, but if you have something helpful to say.
I hope it's helpful.
Okay.
As we went through with Dr. Miltenberger, before 1914, there were lots of acres, up to 98,000, that the Riparian Association had
Yes.
as of 1879. So just the timing makes a difference.
I recall that too. And I was in some ways moving to that. But my understanding is this let me ask it a different way. This 80,000 acres or 75,000 acres includes lands north of Wasco Road that would not be included in your calculation of the 44,000 acres that were irrigated in the 1880s, roughly. Because you're not included, let me try to, can I try to, if there were lands irrigated north of Wasco Road, regardless, we don't need to talk about whether they were or they were not, but if they were, that would not be included in the 44,000 acres number?
That's correct.
Okay.
The 44,000 acre number, I think as Bolton 9 makes clear, is that it was lands south of Wasco Road.
Thank you. Would it, however, be accurate to say that the amount of irrigated acreage within what is now the Buena Vista Water District service area was a subset of the total acreage owned by Miller and Lux?
I think that's generally correct. I think by the time you get around to the district, there are some lands that have been sold, so they're no longer within the Miller and Lux holdings, but I think that's generally correct.
Let me try it a different way. What I was trying to ask is it your understanding that Miller and Lux was not irrigating 100% of the lands that they owned within the service area at this time in the 1880s and 1890s?
That's correct. And I think Bulletin 9, of course, is further in the future, but it gives us some opportunity to look from that perspective backward. And that land classification that we talked about earlier is very important because in Bulletin 9, it identifies within those classes what was irrigable and what wasn't, and the nature of the irrigation in there. Only a small portion, according to Bulletin 9's assessment, by 1920 of the lands within that 43,600 had been properly prepared for irrigation in the assessment of Sidney Harding, among others. There was other areas that weren't, and given the other reporting that we have about the nature of Miller and Lux's operations, the nature of flood irrigation, the continued persistence of contour check irrigation, et cetera, I think it provides us an opportunity to utilize that bulletin. While not from 1914, it actually gives us a much better assessment in many ways. because it was cognizant of things that other sources may not have been.
Thank you. And I'll try to ask this, I think, is my last question. It's on this line. It may take me a couple of questions to get there. But I'm wondering if you had a sense from your review of the historical documents in Bulletin 9, whether your assessment on the limitation on irrigation, what the reason for that was. And I'll give a couple of possibilities that come to my mind so you can respond and tell me where I am maybe on track or wrong. One is a possibility is that supply was limited, and that limited the amount of acres that could be irrigated. Another, as you mentioned, was that some of the acres weren't properly prepared for irrigation and therefore they weren't irrigable. I think related to that is a possibility that there just wasn't adequate infrastructure to bring the available water to particular lands. That might be related. Did you have a sense about whether some or all or other factors were relevant to the amount of acres that were being irrigated by Miller and Lux at this time?
I think you touched upon the most critical, Ms. Kinsey, from the historical record I reviewed. And to be clear, I'm again relying on the documents and reporting of the era. I might add that as later assessments, say by Sidney Harding regarding the viability of the district's initial plans, which were scaled down, he noted that the available water supply was a major limiting factor on the amount of acreage that was feasible for the district. He also pointed out to the poor quality of some of the lands and inefficiencies in the system. There were individuals, and Harry Barnes makes this point too, there were second point water users like Carmel Cattle Company circa 1920 who could barely get any water because of the system being terribly inefficient and not really designed to deliver water in the way we might think of today. So I would add that as well. Oh, and I should mention too, I mean, something I just briefly touched upon, in as much as there was a reliance on the lake, Buena Vista Lake, to provide some water later in the season, it was subject to very high evaporative losses, as are charted in Bulletin 9.
Thank you, Dr. Miltenberger. I appreciate that, and those are all the questions I have at this time. I will hand things over to you, Mr. Bivens, if you have redirect for your witness.
I do have a few, and we'll try to be brief. Ms. Mullen, would you please pull up Exhibit Buena Vista 801, please, and go to PDF page 36. And if you could scroll down towards the bottom of the page. Perfect. That's perfect. And Dr. Miltenberger, do you recall Mr. Becerra asking you questions about this page of Exhibit BV 801?
Yes, I do.
And you testified that the 98,188 acre number referred to by Mr. Treadwell was misleading. Why?
Well, it was only misleading in the context of my analysis, because that acreage, as I alluded to with the questions that Ms. Kinsey was asking, would have encompassed lands in excess of what the current Buena Vista service area is today. It would have included lands, for instance, north of Wasco Road.
Thank you. Ms. Mullen, would you please pull up Exhibit KWBA 14, please, and go to page 72 of the PDF. Dr. Miltenberger, when you were answering Mr. Becerra's questions about this table, you indicated that there was additional context on the preceding page that informed your understanding of these numbers. Do I have that right?
That's correct.
And Ms. Mullen, would you please scroll up to the previous page? And perhaps a little further up, Ms. Mullen. Thank you. That's perfect. Dr. Miltenberger, what was the additional context you wanted to provide from page 64 of Bulletin 9?
Yes, it's actually something I alluded to earlier with Ms. Kinsey's question. And I'll just point to the last sentence of this particular paragraph and section, that for the period from 1911 to 1918, 2/3 of the water stored was lost and only 1/3 was used. And I think that's important context to appreciate what that table is trying to convey.
Thank you. Ms. Mullen, could we have Exhibit Buena Vista 801 back up on the screen, and we'll go to PDF page 149, please. And if we could scroll down. Yes, this is perfect. And Dr. Miltenberger, this is the section of James Ogden's testimony regarding water sales to oil companies, correct?
Correct.
Can you tell from Mr. Ogden's testimony whether the water that was sold by Miller and Lux was used within the Buena Vista Water Storage District service area?
I can't tell from this testimony here.
Can you tell what quantities of water were sold by Miller and Lux to these oil companies based on Mr. Ogden's testimony?
No.
Objection lacks foundation. Dr. Miltenberger testified he hadn't seen the documents from the Miller and Lux records about this subject.
And I do think my question was specifically limited to Mr. Ogden's testimony in this document.
Can we add that as a caveat? Because I do think there is something to that. We had Dr. Miltenberger's testimony that he wasn't familiar with the document about the oil sales. And so you're clarifying, Mr. Bivens, that your question here is limited to the testimony on this page that we are looking at on the screen, which I don't have the citation to.
Correct. I'm not going to ask Dr. Miltenberger about exhibit, I believe it was 663.
Okay. And can we have maybe, I don't know, Ms. Mullins, or if Mr. Bivens, you're familiar with where we are, can we have a full citation to what we're looking at right now for the record?
Yes, this is exhibit Buena Vista 801, PDF page 149.
Okay, thank you. So I'll overrule the objection with that caveat on its limitation.
Thank you. Dr. Miltenberger, you referred to your research strategy in response to Mr. Becerra's cross-examination questions. What was your research strategy in developing your written testimony?
Objection beyond the scope of Dr. Miltenberger's written testimony. There is no description in that testimony as to what his research strategy was.
That's true, Mr. Becerra, but I'm going to overrule it. You raised, I think you raised the issue, elicited the issue through your cross-examination, so I'll allow the question.
My research strategy was informed by my training for my doctorate and for my over 15 years of experience researching land and water issues in the American West. As I mentioned, I believe in my testimony under questioning from Mr. Becerra, no historian can ever say they've seen absolutely everything. It really becomes a question of identifying those documents most pertinent to the questions at hand. And that's what I endeavored to do broadly through my written testimony. And that's why I gravitated towards these assessments made by USDA engineers, state engineers, individuals who had or could provide an independent assessment outside of Miller Lux's own internal reporting. As for the Miller Lux collection itself, as we discussed, it's exceedingly large. And like any historian, I relied upon the finding aid that had been developed by the archives to guide my research. And that allowed me to identify what I believe were some of the most pertinent documents to get to these essential questions, not of the Miller and Lux holdings as a piece, because those Miller and Lux corporate holdings, could be corporate records, also spoke to land in Nevada and Oregon, as well as other parts of California, all the way up into Fresno and Merced. So my research strategy aimed to identify those most pertinent to this area. And I read those documents as as we were just discussing, Ms. Kinsey, with an eye to the fact that Miller and Lux weren't giving us information for today. We have to glean that information from what's presented. And their holdings were far in excess of the district today. So narrowing that down was part of that approach. This is the kind of approach that any historian would take. Framing their research questions, identifying collections that could best address those, and relying upon archives and collections and descriptions there to guide the documents that they look at.
Thank you.
Mr. Bivens, I'm going to exercise my prerogative and interrupt you. I have a question for Dr. Miltenberger. I think on this topic that would be helpful to me to understand what the approach a professional historian would take when reviewing documents and the work of another historian. So I wanted to ask you if you had been asked or were asked to review the work of another professional historian who had put together, for example, testimony and cited to documents and cited, for example, to the collection at the Bancroft Library, the Miller and Lux collection at the Bancroft Library, which, as you described, includes hundreds, more than 100 and possibly hundreds of boxes of documents. Would you consider that to be an appropriate citation by another professional historian, and that would give you the tools that you needed and the information and the sources that you needed to review their work? Or would you expect a more specific method of citation to identify the specific documents within the collection that the historian reviewed?
When you say citation, what do you mean, Ms. Kinsey? I'm not.
Well, and that may be part of my question. So yeah, I think this is not intended to be a trick question. I mean, in your testimony, I don't have that citation in front of me. In your testimony, you discussed, I believe, reviewing documents from the Bancroft Library and the Miller and Lux collection. And then through Mr. Becerra's cross, we come to understand that there's quite an extensive collection. I think I was actually aware of that before this, but quite an extensive collection of documents. Famous, yes, and many boxes. So I'm wondering and I imagine this comes up in any kind of historical review, you might have this situation where there's an overwhelming number of documents. As a historian, when you are putting together the information, is it your practice to cite to specific documents and sources when you are putting together a historical account?
It is. I endeavor to do so. In fact, I would suggest that my written testimony is oversighted for an academic audience, precisely because I wanted to do my best to ensure that someone else could reproduce my research. And I think the citations that I have provided, I think, would enable that. And I'll say too, as I think I indicate in my written testimony, it's very, very rare that an historian is treading new ground. And there has been previous work done on Miller and Lux that I cite in my testimony, and which assisted me in identifying various collections.
And so in this statement in paragraph 33 of your testimony, when you say that examination of Miller and Lux corporate records deposited at the Bancroft Library likewise did not uncover evidence of such a plan of development, your reference to records deposited at the Bancroft Library refers to the records that you reviewed in the course of this investigation, or possibly other investigations, that other professional work that you've done, and does not necessarily, as you said, imply that you laid eyes on every single document.
That's correct.
And that would be a process that you would expect a professional historian to engage in.
That's correct. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bivens, for allowing me to interject.
My
pass
pleasure.
back to you.
Dr. Miltenberger, Mr. Becerra showed you some documents today that you are not familiar with, correct?
Correct.
Does anything in the documents that you saw today change the opinions that you've expressed in your written testimony?
No.
Thank you. I have no further questions for Dr. Miltenberger. I believe you're on mute, Ms. Kinsey.
Thank you. That's already helpful. I was going to say it's 4:15. What I think we have time to do before 5 o'clock, and I would like to give us a hard stop at 5 o'clock, is to consider the remaining outstanding objection to Mr. Miltenberger's testimony, the evidentiary objection, which had to do with the adequacy of his citation to sources and providing those sources as exhibits in this proceeding. I think it might make sense. Yes.
Will I have the opportunity for recross?
Yes, Mr. Becerra, I will give you the opportunity for recross. I apologize.
No problem. Thank you.
Well, let's pause.
Go
Well, let me go back to that. Dr. Miltenberger, you're still, I'm sorry to say you're still with us. Mr. Becerra, please go ahead. And thank you for reminding me when I skip a step.
Thank you. I think it's very brief. Dr. Miltenberger, you indicated that your research strategy defined what documents you reviewed as part of your research, correct?
I wouldn't characterize it that way. I would say my research strategy guided me in my research, in my review of documents, and identification and review of documents.
Is it accurate to say that your research strategy excluded consideration of the sworn testimony of James Ogden in the 1913 title insurance case?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I want to be certain I understand.
You did not cite the 1913 testimony of James Ogden, Miller and Lux's ranch manager, in your testimony, correct?
That's correct.
Is it accurate to state that your research strategy excluded consideration of Mr. Ogden's 1913 testimony?
No.
Yet you did not cite it in your testimony, correct?
I did not cite it.
Thank you. I have no further recross.
Thank you, Mr. Becerra. Now I'm going to turn to whether we want to reach the final outstanding motions with respect to Dr. Miltenberger's testimony. If we can, Dr. Miltenberger, thank you for your testimony today. I appreciate it. If maybe I can ask Mr. Bivens that your witness will stay with us momentarily, just until the end of the day, in case there are other questions that come up when considering the sources and that kind of thing, and we can still have him here, that may be helpful. Are there any concerns about or suggestions as to how we might handle this more efficiently, rather than going ahead and dealing with those outstanding objections? I believe I have them both from, if I am remembering accurately, I know Buena Vista has an outstanding portion of their motion on this issue, and then I believe it's KCWA who also raised an objection, and I don't, you will remind me, yeah, KCWA, I don't think City of Bakersfield did, but you can tell me if I'm wrong. So I will look to you, Mr. Becerra. Does that make sense to you? Or would you rather pick this up tomorrow morning?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay.
We would renew our objection to Dr. Miltenberger's testimony and exhibits that simply repeat technical reports following Lake Isabella's construction. I believe that's his exhibits 21, 22, 23. And I need to review his testimony about this. My apologies for taking a moment. That would be paragraphs 70 through 87 of his testimony We have copious water use records from that period. Dr. Miltenberger simply repeats opinions of others who we are unable to cross-examine. So we renew our objections.
That renewal is noted. I will, at this time, overrule that objection for the same reasons stated in my written ruling, but will consider it certainly with respect to the weight of the evidence to be afforded to the testimony. Mr. Becerra, I will turn to you. Do you, I read your motion, but do you have anything to add to your objection with regard to Dr. Miltenberger's use of sources and, as you allege, failure to submit all of his sources for the testimony?
I believe that was actually Mr. Jacobs who filed that.
It was only, I know Mr. Jacobs did. Was that not part of the, okay, that's fair. Maybe it was just Mr. Jacobs. Mr. Jacobs, I will turn to you then. I'll give you a moment.
I'm trying to unmute. There we go.
Go.
I don't have anything to add specifically to that. I think he confirmed that many of his sources were not submitted. I do think on the hearsay issue, we confirmed with my very, very brief cross that the entirety of the evidence upon which he relied were historical documents. Therefore, any findings based on that are findings based on hearsay entirely. And I think that should be excluded.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobs. I will, on the hearsay objection, your renewal of the objection is noted, and your objection that about hearsay is noted for the record. I overrule it for the same reasons described in my written ruling. I am also going to overrule the portion of your motion with respect to Dr. Miltenberger's testimony for lack of appropriate provision of sources. What I will note on that is although generally speaking, it is appropriate for expert witnesses to submit their sources as exhibits in the proceeding. It's helpful for the parties and allows the parties to examine those sources, to cross-examine on the basis of those sources, and to engage their own expert witnesses to attempt to reproduce the investigation. I also want to note that it is helpful to the hearing officer and ultimately the board as the decision maker to have access to those sources, because it helps for us to investigate the basis and the persuasive value of the testimony. In this case, after reviewing Dr. Miltenberger's testimony, his sources, and asking him some questions today, and on the basis of your questions of him today, I come to the conclusion that his citation to sources is appropriate, with, as is done in the course of his professional, the professional practice of historians, and that to the extent that sources may not have been provided and are not available to me, that will go to the weight of the value that I will afford the testimony rather than its admissibility up front. So with that, I believe I've ruled on the remainder of the motions affecting Dr. Miltenberger's testimony. Let's not move exhibits into evidence now. So we will come back to this, but I did want to close that portion of this that I left open in the written ruling this morning. We are now at the end of our day. It's 4:25. I'm sure we're all ready to take a break, but before we break until tomorrow morning we would start with, I believe, your next witness, Mr. Bivens and Mr. O'Brien. Before we break, are there any other issues that we should address or that we need to be working on before we reconvene tomorrow morning?
Just one, Ms. Kinsey. I don't know how quickly we will go tomorrow, but it would be helpful to know which of Buena Vista's witnesses will be testifying. I know we objected to the entirety of Mr. Kika's testimony and portions of others. So I know you indicated earlier you expected to get a ruling on that out. Just hoping we can get that so I can know how late I need to stay up tonight to prepare for those.
That's fair. I will get it out to you as soon as possible, but I would say you should be prepared for Buena Vista to put on. Let me back up. I mean, you have quite a few. You have 3 more witnesses, is my understanding, to present. So I don't know how far we'll get tomorrow, but I will be getting a ruling on Buena Vista's motions to you. I mean, your motions with respect to Buena Vista's evidence tomorrow. It won't be before tomorrow. But if for any reason you should be prepared for Buena Vista to put on its case.
Thank you. That's helpful.
I hope it is. And I will be prepared to issue a written ruling. So we all have our work cut out for us. I appreciate all of your professional work. I know this is a lot. Anything else before tomorrow?
Thank you, Ms. Kinsey.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. Thank you, Dr. Miltenberger, for joining us today. And I will see you in the morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.